Suppose I should share my screen. Huh? Screen share. All right. So this tutorial is just a quick introduction to some web APIs. And so if you don't know, API just stands for Application Programming Interface. And so basically the essentials of what an API is it's code that someone else has written that you're calling the functions that they've made and getting whatever results they return to you. That's pretty much the basics of what an API is. Now, a web API means that you're accessing some endpoints that someone has set up in their own application on a web server. And so that means you have to make some HTTP requests over the web. So the first example, the quick example that I'm going to show you is just how to use the Slack API. So recently I've started using Slack in some projects that I'm working on as for logging different things. So this project, it has several scripts that get run like once every hour. And so before they just got the output of those scripts were written to a file, and it's just like too many files and too much output to manually sift through. And so what I wanted to do is have some way to when there's like an error or an exception thrown, that it gets logged into Slack. So then I'd be able to get a notification saying like, hey, this error happened. You should go check this out, so that I wouldn't have to go into the log files and see like, oh, it crashed, you know. So it's pretty easy once you get a Slack channel set up and everything. There's if you go to their api.slack.com, you can start like making your own app. And what I used, and this is kind of the simplest way to use it for my purposes, is just creating it's called an incoming webhook. And so what it is let me scroll down here. So here's an example of like how to, if you've ever used curl before, this would be like using the webhook to post. So if we look at the command, it's a post request, HTTP request. And then whenever you create your app, it'll give you this unique URL, which hooks up to your specific Slack channel that you set up. And then all you do is pass as a JSON object what you want it to say. So like you just have a field called text, and then whatever you want it to say. So then what I did with that, and I can show you just an example if I scroll up. So like here, this one gets run once a day. I just have it log like when it starts and then the elapsed time it took for doing whatever it had to do. So if we scroll up to here, is when I first started using it. And here you can see got some validation errors. And here I got an exception, which was nice to see, because just from this, I realized that when I opened the file, I should have opened it as read binary when I only did it as a read. And so I got a notification on it, and I was able to fix it right away. So let's take a look. So I just created it in this logging utils. I use Python for my project, so that's what I'll be using in here. If you want to do it in Java or anything else, pretty much every language has its own way of sending HTTP requests, so it'll be fairly similar. So let's open it up. And so in Python, there's this logging library, which you can use to set up log files, or you can log to the console or make your own custom logger. And so I made my own custom Slack webhook handler. And so it just inherits from the base class logging handler. And all you have to do to initialize it is just pass in the unique URL that gets generated when you make your app. And then all you have to do is define this emit function, which is what gets called once whenever it's going to be emitted to the file or whatever it is. And so this record is just like the message you send in and any other arguments. And so I use the formatter to format it. And then, so this request library is a Python library for sending HTTP requests. So then I just do requests.post, give it the URL, give it the entry, which is just a string of the formatted message. And then headers saying that the content type is a JSON object. And then created a custom formatter, since like I showed you here, it has to have its own special format. And so just the initializer here, and then all you have to do is create the format method. And so all this does is calls the superclasses format method, which it's basically like the C print function. If you use like %s and %f, it'll format it like that. And then return it as the JSON string with text and then the formatted message like it shows here. So that's literally all I had to do to get like a quick thing set up. So if I just pull up interactive Python, let's pull this up here. Okay, so I'm going to import logging, and I'm going to create a logger object. And this is just giving it a unique name so it knows what to tie it back to. Then we're going to create, let me import Slack. Okay, so I'm going to create the handler first. Oops. Actually need to get OS. So I have, since I don't want to show my webhook URL to whoever watches this video, I have it set up in an environment variable. And so just getting it just like that. And then I'll create the formatter. And then you can do the handler.set formatter. And so then this just tells the handler, whenever you call the self.format, use this formatter object that I'm passing in. Then I can do logger.add handler, pass in that. So then if I do look at the handlers, we can see our Slack webhook handler. So for example, now all I have to do is wherever in my code, if I want to in like a try except, if I get an exception, I can do logger.error and say an exception happened. Whoops. And then you can see on the right-hand side here, we got the message, an exception happened. So yeah, pretty simple. And I mean, you can since you're making your own custom handler, you can do pretty much whatever you want. There's more sophisticated ways of doing messages. You know, you can have like different colors and different things like that. So you can make it however sophisticated you want. I just needed something super simple. So that's why I went with. Any questions on the Slack stuff? Okay. So the second API, just to give you another example of an API, I'm looking at, it's called Open Weather Map, and it's just a website that has a free API for getting weather information. And it's all you have to do is create an account, and then they give you an API key to send with. So if we look, oh yeah, one thing you always want to like pay close attention to. So for some services, you can pay for it. Like in this case, in Open Weather Map for the free version, you get 60 calls per minute. So you can't use it more than 60 times per minute. But if you're making an app that depends on this, and you have a whole bunch of users, you know, you could have a whole bunch of people calling it per minute. And so you might want to go into the paid subscriptions. But so that's something you always want to pay attention to if you're paying for it, is that you want to see like how many calls per minute you get, and it shows like the different features you get. These are different like availability percentages that they guarantee for you, how often it updates. So for the free version, the API data says it'll update less than every like 2 hours or so. For the paid ones, it'll update like less than every 10 minutes. So yeah, just something to pay attention to, and especially if it's something where you do a whole bunch of, if you pay per call, and when you're testing or you're kind of underestimating how many calls you'll do and you call too many times, you could rack up a nice bill. So just pay attention to that. So then if we look at their API, they have several different features you can do. You can look at the current weather data. You can look at a 5-day/3 hour forecast, etc. For this example, I'm just looking at the current weather data. And this is another thing, is with any API you use, you're going to have to get used to reading their documentation to see exactly how you're supposed to use it and what you can expect to get back after you call it. So in this case, this first section is just saying like basically how to tell it what location you want. You can use a city name. They have specific city IDs that you can use. You can look it up by geographic coordinates, or you can just look up by zip code. And so for this example, I'm just using a zip code to do it. And so it gives you, the other thing is it's also good to note what they default to. So it says like here, please note if the country is not specified, then the search works for USA as a default. And so that's with a lot of APIs, is if they'll have like a whole bunch of fields that you can call it with, but if you don't happen to call it with some things, then it has certain defaults that it defaults to. So it just gives an example here of what a call would look like. So it's api.openweathermap.org/data/2.5/weather, and then zip, and then you specify the zip code, and then comma country code. So it gives like an example here. And so we can actually, since this is just an HTTP request, and it'll return it as JSON. We can just click on it and see what the JSON looks like as a result of what we would get if we looked up this zip code. So just to give you an idea, I have this tool here that formats it. So it returns back, since we're looking up by zip code, it gives like the coordinates it used for that zip code, whether it has a different ID, Maine, it says it's raining there, and it's a light rain. Some other stuff, temperature. And so this is interesting because what we'll see later is that the default, if you don't specify unit, is it returns it to you in kelvins. And so that could be surprising if you're like, what the hell? It's 280 degrees. Yeah, so then it gives you min-max, wind, clouds. This is the timestamp, Unix timestamp. That's the name, just Mountain View, California. Yeah, so it gives you a whole bunch of different stuff that we can look at. So if we keep scrolling down, so here's where it gives like a little description of what it returns to you if it's not super obvious. So you can see like with chords, chord dot long and lat, it's just longitude, latitude. And then we'll see here when we look at the main and main.temp, it says unit default is Kelvin. But you can also specify that you want it in metric or imperial. And if we keep going, let's see. Yeah, so these are like other parameters that you can specify in your call. So you can say what format you want. So you could say mode, have it return to you as XML or HTML instead of JSON if you wanted. You could specify the accuracy you want. And here's kind of what we're looking for is you can specify the units. And so you can specify either standard, metric, or imperial. And that's just by the units keyword. So we could say units equals imperial. And it looks like you can also do multilingual support, yada, yada, yada. Okay, so just an example. So the example that I guess I can just show you off the bat. The example that I wanted to show was like if we wanted just like a simple command line command to print out what the weather is. And so just has it say weather for Grand Forks at, and this is the time that it updated. So that would be what, 5:15 gives the temperature. And then this is the min-max range description, overcast clouds, and then wind speed. So that's kind of what what my idea was, just a simple idea to get across. So if we look at it, hold on a second. So this is basically like the what I did, just some optimization. So we saw with in that table, it said that it updates, it's guaranteed to update like less than 2 hours. And so one thing I wanted is that if we called it within, called it once and then called it again, that it wouldn't make another call since it's probably going to be the same. And so what I did is, let me just quit out of here. So what I did is just made just a lock file, and I use this as like a timestamp as like the last time that I successfully got something from the API. So it's 1724. So then basically what I do with that, if we look at the main function, all I do is call get weather info. So we'll take a look at that. Oops. So get weather info. So first to check and see if the lock file exists. If it doesn't exist, then we'll fetch new weather info from the API. But if it does exist, I get the date time of now, and then get the date time from when the lock file was last modified. Then just subtract it. And then what I do is check if the total seconds of the difference is greater than 60 times 60, which is just an hour ago. So if it's greater than that, then we'll fetch new info from the API, else we'll get the latest info from the file. And so what I do is after every call to that, I just print out to this latest.json. This is the information that I'm concerned with. And you could use whatever you want for that. So then if we take a look at the part that we're most concerned about, the fetch new weather info, what we do, so we pass in the OWM is just Open Weather Map API URL. And that's, I just define that as a constant up here. And then I have just get the app key. And then what I do is I have this defaults dictionary. So zip code, I just defaulted to 58203. The app ID, that's the app key. And then units defaults to imperial. And then, so then what I do is I also have it set up where I can get command line arguments. So then if you specify at the command line like a different zip code or different unit, then it'll overwrite the defaults that I have. And then it just writes it into this, can't really see it there, but this API params dictionary. So if we go back up here, what's really nice about the request library in Python is that you don't have to do like the URL building. So if we look up here, you can see, you know, with requests, with the key value pairs, you have zip equals that, and then the ampersand, and then the next key and value. If you have a dictionary, it just literally does all the building for you and just appends it onto the URL that you specify. So I just call the request.get with those params. And then the response, we check if it's 200 or okay. And then if that's true, then we touch the lock file, and all that does is it updates the modified time. Then we get the JSON response, which is just going to be similar to that. And then I return a new dictionary of getting the things that I'm concerned about. So name is the city. This DT is that Unix timestamp. So I get a datetime object, get the temp description, the min and max range, and then the width and speed. If it's not okay, then I just return none. So if we called get weather info and it fetched it from the API, we would get the info here. And so if check to see if weather info, that just checks to see if it returned none or not. If it didn't, then I call this output weather info, which is just this template here. Yeah, so that just prints it out like we saw, and then prints it out to the screen. And then lastly, I write the latest weather info to file, which is just opening the latest file. I have to do this, change it from the timestamp object or the datetime object back into the timestamp because datetime objects aren't serializable. So I just change that into the original timestamp and then dump it as a JSON object. Yeah, and then if that happens, just have it return 0, which with a lot of system calls and stuff, returning zeros means it was a success, which is different than what you'd usually expect. But or else it returns 1, and then we just do a system.exit for whatever was returned from main. Yeah, so we could, if we rename this and take off the py, what we could do is put our current directory at the front of the path. So now if I echo path, you can see this folder that I'm in is now at the front. So if I went to like the desktop, and if I look at like which weather, it'll say I found an executable called weather here. So if I just type in weather, then it'll give me that weather info. So you can easily make your own like command line utility if you wanted to. Yeah, if I go in there, then we'll see, just to show you. So like I just called it, so at 5:32, but we can see that the latest .lock that it was last changed at 5:24. And so if I called it at 6:25, then it would give me new info and then update this timestamp here. Yeah, so that's just a quick intro to web APIs and neat little utilities that you can create for yourself. Do you guys have any questions or anything? All right, well, I think we'll call that good for this tutorial then.